Dr. Sarah Chen stepped off the transport shuttle onto station Kepler 442b, her boots making contact with the metallic deck plating that hummed with alien energy frequencies. The air tasted different here, recycled through Zephyrian atmospheric processors that left a slight ozone tang on her tongue. Around her, dozens of species moved through the arrival bay with practiced efficiency. Tall, graceful Altarians glided past on their four legs, their crystalline skin catching the station's artificial lighting. Stocky Corvin traders argued in their guttural language near cargo containers that leaked exotic spices into the air. Sarah adjusted the strap of her field equipment bag and consulted the holographic directory floating near the main entrance. The Galactic Conservation Authority headquarters occupied levels 40 through 60 of the massive orbital station. As humanity's first xenobiology specialist to join their ranks, she carried the weight of her species' reputation on her shoulders. The other passengers from her transport gave her curious looks. Humans were still a curiosity in this part of the galaxy, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 3 standard years ago. Most galactic species measured their spacefaring history in millennia. To them, humanity remained an unknown quantity, primitive newcomers who had stumbled into the cosmic community through what many considered dumb luck rather than genuine advancement. Sarah made her way to the transit tube that would carry her to the conservation levels. The tube car contained a mixed group of beings, and she noticed how conversations quieted when she entered. A pair of Rigelian scientists exchanged glances and spoke in hushed tones in their clicking language. Their translator devices weren't active, but Sarah had spent months learning basic Rigelian during her journey here. She caught fragments of their conversation. "Another human," clicked the first scientist. "They multiply like parasites on every world they touch." "This one carries field equipment," responded the second. "Perhaps they think to teach us about wildlife conservation?" Amusing, considering their own planet's ecological disasters. Sarah kept her expression neutral and focused on the transport tube's viewport. Beyond the transparent aluminum, the gas giant Kepler 442 dominated the view, its storm systems swirling in magnificent patterns that no human eyes had seen until recently. Its 12 moons orbited in a complex dance, 3 of them supporting diverse ecosystems that the Galactic Conservation Authority worked to protect. The tube arrived at level 45 with a soft chime. Sarah stepped out into a corridor lined with viewing ports that showcased the protected worlds under the authority's jurisdiction. Holographic displays showed everything from the crystal forests of Vegan Prime to the liquid nitrogen seas of Titan Proxima, where silicon-based lifeforms created living sculptures from mineral deposits. The reception area buzzed with activity. A Centauri administrator with 6 arms worked at multiple data stations simultaneously, her blue-tinted skin shifting color as she processed information. Near the central desk, a group of conservation officers discussed their latest mission reports. Sarah recognized species she had only read about in xenobiology textbooks, the elegant Serenians with their flowing, translucent bodies, the heavily armored Thraccari whose shell-like skin had evolved on a world where everything was predatory. Director Kekstar, a distinguished Zephyrian whose feathered crest marked him as elderly by his species standards, emerged from the main office complex. His amber eyes fixed on Sarah with what she had learned to recognize as polite skepticism. Zephyrians were known throughout the galaxy for their diplomatic nature, but also for their careful evaluation of others' capabilities. "Dr. Chen," Kekstar said, his voice carrying the melodic quality common to his species. "Welcome to Conservation Authority Station Kepler. Your academic credentials are impressive, though I confess some surprise at Earth's decision to send someone so young to such a challenging assignment." Sarah had expected this reaction. At 32, she was indeed young by galactic standards, where most species lived for centuries and gained expertise over decades of careful study. "Director Kekstar, thank you for accepting humanity's application to join the Conservation Authority. I understand this represents a significant leap of faith on your part." "Indeed," Kekstar replied, his crest feathers shifting in what Sarah recognized as mild amusement. "Your species has been spacefaring for less time than most of our junior staff have been studying xenobiology. However, the Council decided that humanity's unique perspective might prove interesting." The word interesting carried implications in galactic standard that ranged from potentially useful to likely catastrophic. Sarah suspected Kekstar meant something closer to the latter. They walked through the main operations center, where holographic displays showed real-time monitoring of dozens of protected ecosystems. Sarah observed conservation officers coordinating with field teams across multiple star systems. The scope of their work impressed her, maintaining biodiversity on hundreds of worlds, protecting endangered species that had evolved under conditions no human had ever imagined. Your first assignment, Kekstar continued, will be on Drakmor Prime. Are you familiar with the world? Sarah nodded. Gas giant moon, heavy gravity, extreme weather patterns. Home to the Drakmor apex predators, the largest land-based carnivores in this sector. Correct. The Drakmor situation has proven challenging for our field teams. The local wildlife has become increasingly aggressive toward our research stations. 3 different teams have requested emergency evacuation in the past 6 months. They stopped before a large holographic display showing Drakmor Prime in detail. The moon's surface featured vast purple grasslands broken by towering rock formations and deep canyons. Weather systems swept across the landscape with the intensity of hurricanes, driven by tidal forces from the gas giant it orbited. The apex predators you mentioned, Kekstar said, manipulating the display to show detailed scans of the creatures, we call them shadows. They're pack hunters, highly intelligent, and they've learned to associate our research equipment with threat. Previous teams have relied on containment barriers and defensive measures. The holographic shadows were magnificent and terrifying. Standing 4 meters tall at the shoulder, they possessed the muscular build of Earth's great cats but, with 6 legs and crystalline protrusions along their spines that could generate bioelectric fields. Their obsidian black hide was marked with patterns that seemed to shift in the light, giving them their name. What approaches have previous teams attempted? Sarah asked, studying the behavioral data scrolling alongside the creature models. Standard protocols, replied Dr. Veltar, a Alta'iran xenobiologist who had approached their group. Her crystalline skin flickered with patterns that Sarah was learning to interpret as professional interest. Perimeter defenses, deterrent fields, remote monitoring systems. The shadows adapt quickly to our technology. They've learned to disable our equipment and have begun coordinating attacks on our installations. Sarah examined the incident reports more carefully. Each team had followed established galactic protocols for dealing with large predators, create barriers, maintain distance, observe from safety. The same approaches that had worked successfully on dozens of other worlds for thousands of years. Dr. Chen, Kekstar said, I must be direct with you. Your species' reputation for aggressive solutions to problems precedes you. The Conservation Authority exists to protect these creatures, not to harm them. Any approaches involving weapons or violence will result in immediate termination of human participation in our organization. Understood completely, Director. May I ask a question about the Shadow's social structure? Of course. The reports mention pack behavior, but the attack patterns seem too coordinated for simple pack hunting. Have previous teams studied their communication methods? Dr. Veltar's skin pattern shifted to what Sarah recognized as surprise. Communication methods? They're apex predators, Dr. Chen. Their communication serves hunting coordination. Perhaps, Sarah replied. But, coordination at this level suggests sophisticated information exchange. On Earth, our apex predators developed complex social hierarchies and communication systems. If the shadows see our equipment as territorial intrusion, they might be responding as they would to any perceived threat to their social structure. The silence that followed felt heavy with skepticism. Around the operations center, other conservation officers had paused their work to listen. Sarah realized she had just suggested that apex predators might be treated as something other than dangerous animals to be contained or avoided. Dr. Chen, Kekstar said carefully, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but the shadows have injured several team members and destroyed expensive research equipment. They are not social creatures seeking communication. They are predators defending territory. What if they're not? Sarah asked. What if they're trying to communicate, and our defensive responses are being interpreted as aggressive displays? Dr. Veltar's crystalline skin now showed patterns Sarah couldn't interpret, but, from the way other staff members stepped closer, she suspected she had said something either very insightful or very foolish. You're suggesting, said another voice, that apex predators are attempting diplomatic contact? Sarah turned to see Commander Thax, a heavily built Corvan whose species had evolved as persistence hunters on high-gravity worlds. His presence commanded immediate attention from everyone in the operations center. I'm suggesting, Sarah replied, that we might be misunderstanding their responses. If they're as intelligent as the reports indicate, maybe they're trying to establish boundaries rather than simply attacking. Commander Thax's laugh rumbled through his chest like distant thunder. Young human thinks she can talk to shadows. This should prove entertaining. Word of Sarah's theory spread quickly through the station. By the time she reached her assigned quarters, she had overheard at least 3 conversations in different languages that she suspected were about the naive human who thought apex predators wanted to chat. Her quarters were standard for the station, compact but officially designed, with a viewport that looked out toward Drakmor Prime's distant surface. Sarah unpacked her equipment while reviewing everything she could access about shadow behavior patterns. The more she studied the reports, the more convinced she became that something crucial was being overlooked. The Shadow's attacks weren't random or purely territorial. They targeted specific types of equipment while leaving others untouched. They disabled rather than destroyed when possible. Most tellingly, they had never actually killed any of the research team members, despite having ample opportunity during the attacks. Her computer chimed with an incoming message from Director Kekstar. Dr. Chen, please report to Briefing Room 7 at 0800 tomorrow. You'll be joining the next mission to Drakmor Prime as an observer. Commander Thax will lead the team. Sarah stared at the message for a long moment. An observer mission meant she wouldn't be allowed to implement any of her theories. She would watch another team follow the same failed protocols, and, when the Shadows responded predictably, her ideas would be dismissed as human naivety. She spent the evening reviewing xenobiology databases, looking for any species that had successfully established communication with apex predators. The results were discouraging. Across thousands of documented first contact scenarios, predator species were consistently managed through containment and avoidance. The galactic community had perfected these approaches over millennia. But, as Sarah reviewed the data, she noticed something interesting. Almost every successful predator management case involved species that were either significantly less intelligent than the Shadows or lived in environments where territorial behavior was clearly defined by physical boundaries. The Shadows occupied vast territories with complex social structures that changed seasonally. Her calm system chimed again, a personal message from her mentor, Dr. Rodriguez, back on Earth. Sarah, I know you're facing skepticism. Remember why they chose you for this assignment. Human pattern recognition evolved through different pressures than most galactic species faced. Trust your instincts, but be smart about how you present your ideas. Show them rather than telling them. Sarah smiled for the first time since arriving at the station. Dr. Rodriguez was right. Every species in the galactic community had evolved their intelligence through different environmental pressures. Humans had developed as persistence hunters and social coordinators on a world where the most dangerous threats often came from other intelligent species. Maybe that perspective was exactly what the Drakmor situation needed. She pulled up the mission briefing materials and began preparing for tomorrow's deployment. But, instead of studying the standard containment protocols, she focused on everything she could learn about shadow social behavior, territory marking, and communication patterns. If she was right about the Shadow's intelligence, tomorrow's mission might provide the perfect opportunity to prove it. If she was wrong, she would likely become another example of human overconfidence in the face of galactic predators. Either way, Sarah Chen was determined to show the Conservation Authority that humanity's approach to dangerous situations might be exactly what the galaxy needed. The shuttle descent to Drakmor Prime felt like riding inside a storm. Atmospheric turbulence from the gas giant's tidal forces shook the craft violently, and Sarah watched through the viewport as lightning storms carved brilliant patterns across the purple grasslands below. The shuttle's Frackery pilot, Lieutenant Zekmor, handled the descent with practiced ease despite conditions that would have challenged most species. Commander Thax sat across from Sarah in the passenger compartment, reviewing tactical displays on his personal interface. The Corvin's massive frame was secured in reinforced restraints designed for high-gravity worlds, and his equipment harness bristled with containment devices, energy barriers, and emergency beacons. First time on a predator world, human? Thax asked without looking up from his displays. First time on this particular predator world, Sarah replied. I've worked with dangerous wildlife before. Earth wildlife, scoffed Dr. Yentel, a Serenian biologist whose translucent body showed the nervous color patterns Sarah had learned to recognize. Your largest predator's mass perhaps 300 kilograms. A single shadow weighs over 2 tons and hunts in coordinated packs. Sarah nodded politely. She had learned that direct contradiction of experienced galactic personnel was rarely productive. Better to demonstrate through action than argue through words. The shuttle broke through the lower cloud layer, revealing the research station below. Base Kepler-7 sat in a cleared area surrounded by energy barriers that created a perfect circle of safety in the middle of shadow territory. The base's modular design allowed for rapid assembly and, if necessary, equally rapid evacuation. As they descended, Sarah observed the landscape beyond the energy barriers. The purple grassland stretched to the horizon, broken by towering rock formations that reminded her of Earth's mesas but, with crystalline structures that caught and reflected light in complex patterns. Movement in the grass suggested the presence of large creatures, though from this altitude she couldn't make out details. The shuttle touched down within the base's protective perimeter with a solid thump that spoke to Lieutenant Zekmore's skill. As the engines spun down, Sarah heard an unexpected sound through the hull, a low, resonant humming that seemed to come from multiple sources around the base. Shadows, Commander Thax explained, noting her attention to the sound. They gather whenever shuttles arrive. Probably attracted by the engine noise. Or announcing our arrival, Sarah murmured, but quietly enough that only she heard. The base commander, a veteran Zephyrian named Colvan, met them at the airlock. His crest feathers showed the wear patterns of someone who had spent considerable time in stressful field conditions, and his greeting was brisk and professional. Commander Thax, welcome back. Dr. Yentel, good to see you again. And, you must be the human specialist we've heard about. Colvan's amber eyes studied Sarah with obvious curiosity. I confess interest in seeing how your species approaches our shadow problem. The humming sound grew louder as they moved through the base's corridors. Sarah noted how it seemed to come in patterns, long tones followed by shorter ones, with variations in pitch that suggested structure rather than random vocalizations. How long have they been making these sounds? Sarah asked. Since we established the base 6 months ago, Colvan replied. The vocalizations intensify whenever we activate certain equipment or when shuttles arrive and depart. Our behavioral specialists believe it's territorial warning calls. They reached the main observation deck, and Sarah got her first clear look at the shadows in their natural environment. Through the reinforced transparent aluminum, she could see at least 12 of the massive creatures arranged in a rough semicircle around the base's perimeter. They stood just beyond the energy barriers, close enough that every detail of their obsidian black hide and crystalline spine protrusions was clearly visible. The sight took Sarah's breath away. The holographic displays at the station hadn't captured the fluid grace of their movements or the obvious intelligence in their positioning. Each shadow maintained a specific distance from its neighbors, creating a formation that was clearly deliberate rather than random. Their heads moved in coordinated sweeps, scanning the base with what looked like systematic observation rather than predatory stalking. Magnificent, Sarah whispered. Dangerous, Commander Thax corrected. Watch what happens when we activate perimeter sensors. He touched a control panel, and sensor arrays around the base extended upward. Immediately, the shadow's behavior changed. The humming intensified and took on different tonal qualities. The creatures moved closer to the barriers, their crystalline spine protrusions beginning to glow with stored bioelectric energy. Aggressive display, Dr. Yentel noted. They're preparing to attack the sensors. Sarah watched more carefully. The shadows were indeed responding to the sensor activation, but their movements seemed more like positioning for communication. They arranged themselves in specific patterns, with larger individuals moving to particular locations while smaller ones filled in gaps. What if we deactivate the sensors? Sarah asked. Pointless, Thax replied. We need those sensors for perimeter monitoring. Just temporarily. To see how they respond. Commander Thax looked skeptical but touched the controls. The sensor arrays retracted, and the change in shadow behavior was immediate. The humming shifted to lower, more rhythmic tones. The creatures stepped back from the barriers and settled into what Sarah could only describe as waiting positions. They're not displaying aggression, Sarah said. They're trying to communicate. Dr. Chen, Colvan said carefully, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but apex predators don't communicate with other species. They establish dominance through displays of strength. What if these apex predators do? Sarah asked. Look at their formation. That's not random positioning for an attack. They've organized themselves into a specific pattern. She moved to the observation deck's main display and called up the base's external sensor data. The shadow positions showed clearly on the tactical overview, and Sarah began tracing lines between their locations. They're arranged in a mathematical pattern, she said, excitement growing in her voice. The distances between individuals follow a progression based on the golden ratio. That's not instinctive territorial behavior, that's deliberate geometric communication. Dr. Yentel's translucent body flickered with colors Sarah hadn't seen before. You're suggesting that creatures who hunt and kill for survival are attempting mathematical discourse? I'm suggesting that creatures intelligent enough to coordinate complex pack hunting and adapt to our technology might be intelligent enough for more sophisticated communication than we've assumed. The humming outside changed again, becoming more complex. Sarah listened carefully, trying to identify patterns in the vocalizations. The tones seemed to cycle through specific sequences, with variations that suggested meaning rather than random sound. Commander Thax, Sarah said, what happens if someone goes outside the barriers? Immediate attack, Thax replied grimly. We lost 3 drones that way in the first week. Not drones. A person. The silence that followed was heavy with disbelief. Dr. Chen, Kolvan said slowly, I cannot authorize anyone to leave the protective barriers. The risk of death is absolute. What if the risk isn't what we think it is? Sarah pressed. What if they attack drones because drones can't communicate, but they might respond differently to a living being who can? That, Commander Thax rumbled, is the most dangerous theory I have ever heard a xenobiologist propose. Sarah studied the shadows through the observation port. Their positioning remained mathematically precise, their vocalizations continued in structured patterns, and, most importantly, they had maintained their current formation for over an hour without any aggressive displays. Base Commander, Sarah said formally, I request permission to test a communication protocol with the Shadow Pack. Absolutely not. What if I stay within emergency retrieval range? Keep the energy barriers at minimum power so I can be pulled back instantly if necessary? Dr. Chen, Dr. Yentel interjected, your species' reputation for reckless behavior is well known throughout the galaxy. This would be suicide. Or, Sarah replied, this might be exactly the kind of approach the situation requires. She turned back to the observation port and watched the shadows' coordinated movements. Everything about their behavior suggested intelligence and intention. If she was right about their communication attempts, the standard galactic protocols of barriers and containment would never work because they were addressing the wrong problem. The humming outside shifted again, and this time Sarah was certain she heard structure in the vocalizations. Patterns repeated with variations, like a language she couldn't yet understand but could recognize as language. One test, she said. Let me approach the barrier edge with communication equipment. Not weapons, not containment devices, just basic audio and visual recording gear. If they attack, you can retrieve me instantly. The human wants to talk to shadows, Commander Thax said, and Sarah couldn't tell if his tone held amusement or horror. The human wants to try something that hasn't been attempted before, Sarah corrected. Every previous team has approached these creatures as animals to be contained. What if they're not animals? What if they're people? The word hung in the air like a challenge. In galactic law, people referred to species capable of abstract thought, symbolic communication, and cultural transmission. Apex predators were specifically classified as non-people to justify containment and control measures. Dr. Chen, Kolvan said, if you're wrong about this. If I'm wrong, you'll have confirmed that standard protocols are correct, and we'll proceed with containment measures. If I'm right, we might be looking at first contact with a new sapient species. Through the observation port, the largest shadow, clearly the pack leader based on size and positioning, turned its massive head directly toward the observation deck. For a moment, Sarah felt certain the creature was looking directly at her through the transparent aluminum. Its eyes held an intelligence that reminded her uncomfortably of looking into the gaze of a human colleague. The humming grew louder, more complex, and Sarah realized that the pack had been trying to communicate with the research base for 6 months. Every equipment activation, every shuttle arrival, every defensive measure had been met with increasingly sophisticated attempts at contact. They weren't attacking the research stations. They were trying to talk to them. Base Commander, Sarah said, I formally request permission to attempt first contact protocols with the Shadow Pack under emergency retrieval conditions. The request would require authorization from Station Kepler and, ultimately from the Conservation Authority Council. But, as Sarah watched the mathematical precision of the shadow formation and listened to the structured complexity of their vocalizations, she knew she was right about their intelligence. The question was whether the galactic community was ready to accept that apex predators might be people too. Outside the barriers, the pack leader let out a long, complex series of tones that sounded almost like a song. The other shadows responded with harmonies that transformed the humming into something that could only be described as music. Sarah smiled. Tomorrow, she was going to try something that no one in the galaxy had ever attempted before. She was going to walk up to a pack of apex predators and try to say hello. The thought terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. The authorization came through faster than Sarah had expected, though she suspected that had more to do with curiosity about human behavior than confidence in her theories. Director Kekstar's message was characteristically diplomatic. The Council agrees to allow Dr. Chen's experimental approach under strict safety protocols. The scientific value of observing human-predator interaction may prove instructive, regardless of outcome. Sarah read between the lines. They expected her to fail spectacularly, but the failure would provide useful data about human limitations in xenobiological situations. Commander Thax had spent the morning reviewing emergency extraction procedures with obvious resignation. The retrieval system can pull you back through the barrier in under 2 seconds, he explained for the third time. The moment you show signs of distress, we activate emergency protocols. Understood, Sarah replied, adjusting the communication equipment harness she would carry. The gear was deliberately non-threatening audio recorders, visual sensors, and a translation matrix programmed with basic mathematical concepts and simple pattern recognition. Dr. Yentel's translucent body showed colors that Sarah had learned meant deep concern. Dr. Chen, in the unlikely event that you survive this encounter, what exactly do you hope to achieve? Basic communication establishment, Sarah replied. If they respond to mathematical concepts or pattern recognition, we'll know they're capable of abstract thought. If they respond to vocal patterns, we'll have the foundation for language development. And if they simply attack you immediately? Then, I'll have learned something important too. Base Commander Kolvan monitored the external sensors from the control center. The Shadow Pack had maintained their formation throughout the night, but their behavior had changed subtly since dawn. The humming had become more frequent and more complex, and several pack members had moved closer to the barriers. They know something's different, Kolvan reported. Heart rate sensors show elevated stress levels, but not the patterns we associate with pre-attack behavior. Sarah studied the pack through the observation port. 12 massive creatures arranged in their geometric formation, with the pack leader positioned at the focal point of their arrangement. Their crystalline spine protrusions showed faint glowing patterns that seemed to pulse in rhythm with their vocalizations. Those spine crystals, Sarah said. Have previous teams studied their function? Bioelectric energy storage, Dr. Yentel replied. They use the stored energy to enhance muscle contractions during hunting. The glow indicates charge level. Or, Sarah suggested, they use bioelectric fields for communication. Like some Earth species use bioluminescence for signaling. The pulsing patterns in the crystals did seem too complex for simple energy storage. Sarah watched as the pack leader's spine crystals brightened, and the pattern was immediately echoed by other pack members in a wave that traveled around their formation. They're signaling each other, she murmured. Look at the pattern transmission speed, that's deliberate communication, not autonomic response. Commander Thax checked his equipment one final time. Dr. Chen, I must state for the record that this violates every established protocol for dealing with apex predators. If you proceed with this plan, you're accepting full responsibility for the consequences. Noted and accepted, Sarah replied. She moved toward the barrier control station, where a small section could be temporarily deactivated to allow passage. The energy field hummed with power that made her teeth ache, but beyond it lay the answer to questions that had been building since her arrival. Final systems check, Kolvan announced. Emergency retrieval standing by. Medical team on standby. Shuttle prepared for immediate evacuation if necessary. Sarah activated her communication equipment and took a deep breath. Lowering barrier section 7. The energy field flickered and died in a 3-meter section, creating an opening just large enough for a person to pass through. Immediately, the Shadow Pack's behavior changed. The humming intensified, and all 12 creatures turned their attention toward the opening. Sarah stepped through the barrier. The first thing that struck her was the silence. Beyond the energy field's constant hum, Drakmor Prime was remarkably quiet. The wind through the purple grass made soft whispering sounds, and, in the distance she could hear the calls of smaller creatures going about their daily lives. The second thing that struck her was the intense attention of 12 apex predators. The pack leader, standing nearly 50 meters away, tilted its massive head and studied her with obvious intelligence. Its crystalline spine protrusions brightened significantly, and the glow pattern spread to the other pack members in a complex sequence that reminded Sarah of a conversation. Sarah activated her recording equipment and took 3 careful steps forward, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid any actions that might be interpreted as threatening. The pack leader's response was immediate, a series of low, harmonic vocalizations that were clearly directed at her. First contact established, Sarah reported through her calm system. Subject appears to be attempting vocal communication. She stopped walking and tried something that felt completely insane. She hummed back. The effect on the pack was electric. Every spine crystal blazed with light, and the vocalizations became incredibly complex. The mathematical arrangement of the pack shifted, with individuals moving to new positions that created different geometric patterns. They're responding to vocal interaction, Sarah reported, excitement building in her voice. Formation patterns are changing in response to communication attempts. Through her earpiece, she heard Commander Thax's voice, "Dr. Chen, the pack leader is approaching your position." Sarah looked up to see the massive creature moving toward her with fluid grace. Each step covered several meters, but the approach was controlled and deliberate rather than aggressive. When the pack leader stopped, it was close enough that Sarah could see the individual crystalline structures in its spine and the complex patterns of its obsidian hide. This close, the creature was even more magnificent and terrifying. Its head was easily the size of Sarah's torso, and its 6 legs ended in retractable claws that could disembowel her with a casual swipe. But what struck her most forcefully was the obvious intelligence in its eyes. The pack leader lowered its head to Sarah's level and made a series of soft vocalizations that sounded almost questioning. The crystalline spine protrusions pulsed with gentle light patterns that created complex designs along its massive frame. Sarah activated her translation matrix and began cycling through basic mathematical concepts, prime numbers, geometric sequences, simple arithmetic progressions. The pack leader listened intently, its head tilting in what looked remarkably like concentration. When Sarah finished the mathematical sequence, the pack leader responded with its own vocalizations. The translation matrix immediately began identifying patterns and structure in the sounds. Within minutes, it had isolated repeated elements that suggested vocabulary and syntax. Base control, Sarah reported, her voice tight with excitement. Translation matrix is identifying linguistic structures in subject vocalizations. This appears to be actual language, not instinctive communication. The pack leader's next series of sounds came through the translation matrix as fragmented concepts: arrival, new, different, understanding, attempt. It's trying to say something about my arrival, Sarah realized. About understanding and attempts at communication. She tried responding with simple concepts through the translation matrix. Understanding, yes; communication, attempt. The pack leader's crystalline spine blazed with light, and it let out what could only be described as an excited call. The rest of the pack responded with complex harmonies that transformed the entire encounter into something approaching a celebration. "Dr. Chen," came Colvan's voice through her earpiece, "we're seeing unprecedented pack behavior. Every individual is participating in synchronized vocalizations. This is not predatory behavior." Sarah looked around at the 12 massive creatures and realized she was standing in the middle of a welcoming ceremony. The geometric formations, the synchronized vocalizations, the carefully controlled approach of the pack leader, all of it had been an attempt to establish peaceful contact with the research base. For 6 months, the Conservation Authority had been interpreting diplomatic overtures as territorial aggression. The pack leader made another series of vocalizations that came through the translation matrix as fragments: many arrivals, understanding refused, attempts ignored, frustration, new different, hope. They've been trying to communicate with every research team, Sarah realized. We've been misinterpreting their diplomatic approaches as attacks. She tried to formulate a response that would convey understanding and peaceful intention. The translation matrix processed her intent and converted it into harmonic patterns similar to the pack leader's vocalizations. The response from the pack was immediate and overwhelming. Every creature began vocalizing in complex harmonies while their spine crystals created light patterns that transformed the entire gathering into something approaching an art form. The mathematical precision of their positioning became even more apparent as they arranged themselves into new geometric forms. Base control, Sarah reported, I believe I'm witnessing a cultural ceremony. The shadows appear to be celebrating successful first contact. Through her earpiece, she heard Dr. Yentel's voice, Dr. Chen, you're suggesting these creatures possess culture? I'm suggesting these creatures are people, Sarah replied firmly. They have language, mathematics, art, and diplomatic protocols. They've been trying to establish peaceful contact with our research teams for months. The pack leader approached even closer and extended one of its massive foreclaws toward Sarah. The gesture was unmistakably deliberate and offered handshake or its equivalent in shadow culture. Sarah reached out and gently touched the extended claw with her gloved hand. The contact seemed to complete some kind of protocol, because the entire pack erupted in celebratory vocalizations while their spine crystals created what could only be described as fireworks displays. The geometric patterns of their formation shifted into new configurations that suggested joy and welcome. First contact successfully established, Sarah reported. The Shadow Pack appears to be celebrating diplomatic recognition. Back at the base, Commander Thax watched the unprecedented display through the observation port. In 30 years of conservation work, he muttered, I have never seen anything like this. The pack leader began another series of vocalizations, these more complex and sustained than any previous communication. The translation matrix worked frantically to process the linguistic structures, gradually assembling meaning from the harmonic patterns. Translation coming through, Sarah reported. Subject appears to be introducing themselves and their pack. They're providing names and roles within their social structure. The pack leader was called something that translated roughly as Bright Pathfinder, and held the position of diplomatic contact for the regional pack confederation. The other pack members had names that reflected their roles: Deep Song Maker, Star Pattern Keeper, Swift Message Carrier. They weren't just apex predators. They were a diplomatic mission. Base control, Sarah said, her voice filled with wonder, I believe the shadows are the authorized representatives of a larger society. They've been trying to establish formal diplomatic contact with the galactic community. The implications struck her as she spoke. The Conservation Authority hadn't been dealing with wildlife management issues. They had been inadvertently suppressing first contact with a sapient species. Bright Pathfinder made another series of vocalizations that the translation matrix rendered as a complex question about Sarah's own social role and the intentions of the Sky Travelers who had established the research base. Sarah took a deep breath and began the most important diplomatic conversation of her career. She had to explain humanity, the galactic community, and the Conservation Authority to a species that had been trying to make peaceful contact for months. As she began to speak, she realized that everything was about to change. For the shadows, for the Conservation Authority, and for humanity's role in the galactic community. The conversation that followed would reshape everyone's understanding of what it meant to be people in a universe full of wonders. The emergency session of the Conservation Authority Council convened within 6 hours of Sarah's first contact report. Director Kekstar presided over a gathering that included representatives from 12 major galactic civilizations, all connected through real-time holographic projection from across the sector. Sarah stood in the center of the council chamber aboard station Kepler 442b, still wearing her field equipment and displaying data recordings from her encounter with the Shadow Pack. Around her, the holographic forms of council members flickered with the various emotional displays of their species, Altuiran crystal and skin showing skeptical patterns, Zephyrian crest feathers indicating deep concern, Corvan postures reflecting military alertness. Dr. Chen, Director Kekstar began, his melodic voice carrying the weight of formal proceedings, your claims require extraordinary evidence. You assert that apex predators previously classified as dangerous fauna are actually a sapient species attempting diplomatic contact. The evidence is comprehensive, Sarah replied, activating her presentation systems. Linguistic analysis shows vocabulary of over 2,000 distinct terms with complex grammatical structures. Mathematical communication demonstrates abstract reasoning capabilities. Cultural ceremonies indicate sophisticated social organization. The holographic display showed recordings of her conversation with Bright Pathfinder, with translation matrices providing real-time linguistic analysis. The complexity of shadow language was undeniable: recursive grammatical structures, symbolic concepts, and cultural references that could only come from advanced intelligence. Counselor Velthera, the Altuiran representative, spoke with patterns of disbelief flickering across her crystalline skin. Dr. Chen, your species has been spacefaring for less than 4 years. What expertise do you possess that senior xenobiologists have missed for centuries? The expertise of being apex predators ourselves, Sarah replied. Humans evolved as persistence hunters and social coordinators on a world where intelligence was necessary for survival. We recognize intelligence in others because we understand the environmental pressures that create it. Counselor Thrackmore, representing the Corvin Collective, shifted in his chair with obvious skepticism. Your species' reputation for violence precedes you. Perhaps you see aggression as communication because that is your nature. Or perhaps, Sarah countered, we recognize communication attempts from other predator species because we understand what desperation looks like when someone keeps ignoring your attempts to talk. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Sarah had just suggested that the galactic community's approach to apex predators was fundamentally flawed. Director Kekstar manipulated the display to show tactical analyses of previous shadow encounters. Dr. Chen, these creatures destroyed research equipment and forced evacuation of 3 separate missions. How do you explain this behavior if they were attempting peaceful contact? Sarah highlighted specific incident reports and overlaid them with her new understanding of shadow communication. They targeted non-essential equipment while leaving life support systems untouched. They used minimal force necessary to disable threats while avoiding harm to personnel. They maintained formation patterns around research sites that were defensive rather than aggressive. She paused the display on a recording from 2 months ago showing shadows carefully dismantling a perimeter sensor array while research team members watched from behind barriers. Look at their movements. They're not destroying equipment, they're trying to disable surveillance systems that they interpret as hostile monitoring. You're suggesting, Counselor Velthera said slowly, that they viewed our research operations as invasive? I'm suggesting they viewed unannounced surveillance as a hostile act by unknown alien visitors, Sarah replied. Their response was to disable the surveillance while making increasingly desperate attempts to establish communication. Commander Thax, participating via hologram from Base Kepler 7, provided supporting testimony. The human's interpretation aligns with observed behavior patterns. Shadow actions were consistently restrained compared to their obvious capabilities. Sarah activated recordings from her extended conversation with Bright Pathfinder, which had continued for several hours after first contact. The translation matrix had evolved throughout the conversation, developing more sophisticated understanding of shadow linguistic structures. Bright Pathfinder explains that shadows maintain diplomatic protocols with 17 other species on Drakmor Prime, Sarah reported. They have complex trade relationships, territorial agreements, and cultural exchanges with other intelligent species that we classified as fauna. The implications struck the Council like a shockwave. If the Shadows were part of a larger diplomatic community on Drakmor Prime, the Conservation Authority had been treating an entire civilization as wildlife. Impossible, Counselor Thrackmore rumbled. Our surveys identified no technological civilizations on Drakmor Prime. Our surveys looked for technology similar to our own, Sarah replied. The Shadows and their allies use biotechnology, mathematical architecture, and energy manipulation through biological systems. We didn't recognize it because it's not based on metals and electronics. She displayed recordings of shadow territory markers, crystalline structures that generated complex electromagnetic patterns for long-distance communication. What previous surveys had classified as natural mineral formations were actually sophisticated communication networks. The rock formations around shadow territory, Sarah explained, are cultivation centers for specialized crystals that store and transmit information. Their cities are grown rather than built, integrated with natural systems in ways that don't show up on technological scans. Counselor Yarwin, representing the Serenian Alliance, spoke with obvious distress. Dr. Chen, if your analysis is correct, the Conservation Authority has been inadvertently suppressing contact with multiple sapient species for decades. Not just suppressing, Sarah said quietly. We've been classifying entire civilizations as animals and managing them as wildlife. The weight of that realization settled over the council chamber. Hundreds of worlds under Conservation Authority protection might harbor sapient species that had been systematically prevented from making contact with the galactic community. Director Kekstar was quiet for a long moment before speaking. Dr. Chen, what do the Shadows request of us now that communication has been established? Sarah smiled for the first time during the proceedings. They want to apply for membership in the Galactic Conservation Authority. The silence that followed was absolute. They want to join us? Counselor Velthera asked. Bright Pathfinder explains that Shadows have been observing our conservation efforts for months, Sarah replied. They approve of our goals and want to contribute their knowledge of planetary ecosystems to help protect other worlds. She displayed recordings of Bright Pathfinder describing shadow conservation techniques, biological approaches to ecosystem management that worked with natural systems rather than imposing technological solutions. They've maintained stable ecosystems on Drakmor Prime for over 12,000 years, Sarah reported. They want to share those techniques with the galactic community. Commander Thax leaned forward in his holographic projection. They have knowledge we need? They have perspectives we need, Sarah corrected. The Shadow Confederation includes species that have developed biological sciences far beyond our current understanding. They manipulate genetics through symbiotic relationships, create living architecture that adapts to environmental changes, and maintain planetary climates through ecosystem engineering. The recording showed examples of shadow biotechnology, living buildings that grew and adapted to their inhabitants' needs, transportation systems based on trained creatures that traveled between worlds, communication networks that used biological systems to transmit information across interstellar distances. It's a completely different approach to civilization, Sarah explained. They achieve technological complexity through biological engineering rather than mechanical systems. Counselor Thrakmore studied the displays with obvious interest. This biotechnology, it could revolutionize our conservation efforts. More than that, Sarah said. It could revolutionize our understanding of what civilization looks like. The shadows aren't just another species applying for membership, they represent an entirely different model of how sapient beings can develop and thrive. Director Kekstar activated his own displays, showing preliminary assessments based on Sarah's data. The implications are staggering. If the shadow model proves viable, we could develop conservation techniques that work with natural systems rather than requiring technological intervention. That's exactly what they're offering, Sarah replied. Bright Pathfinder has outlined a collaborative research program that would combine shadow biotechnology with galactic conservation science. Counselor Yarwin's translucent body showed patterns of excitement. Dr. Chen, how soon can formal diplomatic contact be established? It already has been, Sarah replied. Bright Pathfinder is waiting at Base Kepler 7 with a formal delegation representing the Shadow Confederation. They're prepared to present their membership application to the Conservation Authority Council. The chamber erupted in discussion as council members began considering the logistics of the first formal diplomatic contact with the Shadow Confederation. Questions flew about translation protocols, cultural exchange procedures, and integration of biotechnology with existing conservation methods. Through it all, Sarah watched with quiet satisfaction. The conversation had shifted from whether the shadows were sapient to how quickly formal diplomatic relations could be established. Dr. Chan, Director Kekstar said, bringing order back to the chamber, your species has achieved something remarkable. In 4 years of spacefaring, humanity has made first contact with a civilization that our established protocols failed to recognize for decades. Humanity didn't achieve this, Sarah replied. Individual humans achieve this by approaching the situation differently than established protocols suggested. Sometimes the newcomer's perspective is exactly what's needed to see what everyone else missed. Counselor Velthara's crystalline skin showed patterns that Sarah recognized as respect. Dr. Chen, the Conservation Authority would like to formally request that humanity establish a Xena contact division. Your species' approach to first contact situations may prove invaluable as we review our protocols for other protected worlds. Sarah nodded, understanding the magnitude of what was being offered. Humanity was being invited to take a leadership role in developing new approaches to contact with sapient species. I believe humanity would be honored to contribute, she replied. But, the real honor belongs to the shadows, who spent 6 months patiently trying to communicate with visitors who kept interpreting their diplomacy as aggression. As the council session moved toward formal recognition of the Shadow Confederation, Sarah reflected on the morning's events. She had walked through an energy barrier to meet apex predators and ended up facilitating humanity's first major diplomatic success in the galactic community. More importantly, she had helped establish contact between two very different forms of civilization, opening possibilities for collaboration that neither side had previously imagined. The apex predators had indeed obeyed her commands, but only because she had been intelligent enough to realize that what they really wanted was the chance to give commands of their own. 6 months after first contact, the joint research facility on Drakmor Prime had become something unprecedented in galactic history, a fully integrated xenobiological research station where traditional technology worked alongside living biotechnology in ways that previous generations of scientists had never imagined possible. Sarah walked through the facility's bio-integrated corridors, where shadow-grown crystalline structures provided both structural support and environmental control. The walls themselves were alive, responding to the inhabitants' needs by adjusting temperature, humidity, and air composition through biological processes that made conventional life support systems seem crude and wasteful. The transformation had been remarkable to witness. Where energy barriers once separated species in mutual misunderstanding, now shadow researchers worked directly alongside galactic scientists, sharing knowledge and developing approaches to conservation that neither group could have achieved alone. Dr. Chen, called Dr. Veltar, her Altair crystalline skin showing patterns of excitement. The morning reports from the Kepler Prime survey team just arrived. You need to see this. Sarah joined her colleague at the main communication console, where data from 17 different worlds was being processed simultaneously. The survey teams were part of the Conservation Authority's new First Contact protocols, developed specifically to identify sapient species that might have been previously overlooked. The results were staggering. 47 potential sapient species identified in the last 6 months, Dr. Veltar reported. The Kepler Prime team believes they've made contact with crystalline entities that communicate through harmonic resonance patterns in planetary bedrock. Sarah reviewed the data with wonder and concern. Across the galaxy, survey teams trained in Sarah's recognition techniques were discovering intelligent life in forms that previous protocols had completely missed. Gas cloud entities that thought in geological timescales, plant networks that achieved consciousness through root system integration, silicon-based lifeforms that communicated through tectonic activity. How many? Sarah asked quietly. Current estimates suggest we may have misidentified as many as 300 sapient species as fauna or geological phenomena, Dr. Veltar replied. The Galactic Council is calling it the Great Recontact. Bright Pathfinder approached from the biotech laboratory, where she had been working with Corvin engineers to develop new approaches to terraforming that worked with planetary ecosystems rather than replacing them. The shadow diplomat now wore a translation device that provided real-time communication, though her English had improved dramatically over the months of collaboration. Sarah Friend, Bright Pathfinder said, using the affectionate term that had developed in shadow diplomatic language, the morning brings troubling reports from the Thrakkery border regions. Sarah turned her attention to the new data Bright Pathfinder was displaying. The Thrakkery Collective, one of the most militaristic civilizations in the galaxy, was protesting the Conservation Authority's new First Contact protocols. They're claiming that recognizing these species as sapient threatens established territorial claims, Bright Pathfinder explained. Several worlds that the Thrakkery classified as resource extraction sites now show evidence of native sapient populations. The implications were immediate and serious. The Great Recontact wasn't just a scientific revolution, it was a political crisis that challenged the territorial claims of major galactic powers. How are the other civilizations responding? Sarah asked. Commander Thax materialized on the holographic communication system, his image transmitted from the main Conservation Authority headquarters. Mixed reactions, he reported. Progressive civilizations like the Altarians and Serenians are embracing the new protocols. Conservative powers like the Thrakkery and some Corvin factions view this as human interference in established galactic order. Sarah studied the political analysis scrolling across her displays. Humanity's success with the Shadows had established them as leaders in Xenocontact protocols, but it had also made them targets for criticism from civilizations whose territories were being challenged by newly recognized sapient species. What's the official position from Earth? She asked. Full support for expanded contact protocols, Commander Thax replied. Ambassador Rodriguez transmitted a formal statement yesterday supporting the right of all sapient species to galactic recognition, regardless of how long they've been misclassified. Sarah smiled at the mention of her former mentor, who had been appointed as humanity's first ambassador to the Galactic Council. Dr. Rodriguez had built upon Sarah's initial success to establish humanity as a voice for progressive Xenocontact policies. Bright Pathfinder activated additional displays showing collaborative research results from across the facility. Shadow biotechnology had revolutionized conservation approaches on dozens of worlds, while galactic engineering had helped shadow communities develop new capabilities for interstellar communication and travel. The success creates new challenges, Bright Pathfinder observed. Some species fear that rapid changes threaten traditional approaches to galactic civilization. Change is always challenging, Sarah replied. But the alternative is leaving hundreds of sapient species classified as animals. A new communication alert interrupted their conversation. Director Kekstar appeared on the holographic display, his Zephyrian features showing the strain of recent political pressures. Dr. Chen, I need to brief you on a developing situation, Kekstar said without preamble. The Thackeray Collective has formally challenged the Conservation Authority's new protocols before the Galactic Council. They're demanding that human involvement in Xenocontact operations be suspended pending a full review of our methods. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. On what grounds? They claim that human reckless interference with established wildlife classifications threatens galactic stability. They've filed formal protests about 17 worlds where newly recognized sapient species are disputing Thackeray territorial claims. The political dimensions of the Great Recontact were becoming clear. Sarah's breakthrough with the shadows had opened the door to recognizing hundreds of previously overlooked sapient species, but it had also challenged the territorial assumptions that underpinned galactic civilization. What's the Council's position? Sarah asked. Divided, Kekstar replied. Progressive factions support expanded recognition protocols. Conservative factions view this as destabilizing interference with established order. The deciding vote will likely come from neutral civilizations who haven't taken strong positions yet. Bright Pathfinder studied the political analysis with obvious concern. The Shadow Confederation offers support for human protocols, she said. Our alliance networks include 47 species across 12 star systems. We will speak for recognition rights at council proceedings. Sarah realized that the situation had evolved far beyond her initial contact with the shadows. The success of that first encounter had catalyzed a galaxy-wide reconsideration of what sapients looked like and who deserved recognition as people. Director, Sarah said, what exactly does the Thackeray Challenge propose? Complete suspension of human-developed contact protocols, Kekstar replied. Return to traditional classification methods. Reversal of sapience recognition for species contacted using human methods. Including the shadows? Including the shadows. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. The Thackeray weren't just challenging human methods, they were trying to reverse the recognition of hundreds of newly contacted species. That won't happen, Sarah said firmly. The shadows and their allied species aren't going back to being classified as animals. They're people, and they have rights. Dr. Chen, Kekstar said carefully, the political situation is complex. The Council must consider the stability of existing territorial arrangements. The Council must consider the rights of sapient beings, Sarah replied. That's supposed to be the foundation of galactic civilization. Bright Pathfinder activated her own communication systems, connecting with the Shadow Confederation networks across multiple star systems. Within minutes, responses began arriving from dozens of species that had been contacted using human-developed protocols. The Confederation stands united, Bright Pathfinder reported. 47 recognized species formally request representation at Council proceedings. We demand recognition of our rights as sapient beings. Commander Thax leaned forward in his holographic projection. Dr. Chen, this is becoming larger than the Conservation Authority can handle alone. The situation requires direct intervention from the Galactic Council. Sarah understood what that meant. The challenge to human contact protocols would be decided by a formal council vote, with the rights of hundreds of newly recognized species hanging in the balance. I need to address the council directly, Sarah said. Impossible, Kekstar replied. The council doesn't allow testimony from individual researchers. What if I'm not testifying as an individual researcher? Sarah asked. What if I'm testifying as the designated representative of newly contacted sapient species? Bright Pathfinder's crystalline spine protrusions began glowing with excitement. The Confederation could formally designate Sarah Friend as our diplomatic representative to the Galactic Council. This would give her standing to address territorial challenges. The implications struck everyone simultaneously. If the newly contacted species united under formal diplomatic representation, they could present their case directly to the Council rather than relying on the Conservation Authority to speak for them. 47 species could formally petition for Council recognition as a unified confederation, Commander Thax mused. That would require the Council to address the territorial challenges through formal diplomatic procedures. Rather than simply voting to reverse recognition, Sarah added. They would have to treat this as a dispute between established powers and newly recognized civilizations. Director Kekstar's holographic image flickered with what Sarah recognized as excitement. Dr. Chen, you're proposing to transform a bureaucratic dispute into formal first contact proceedings. I'm proposing to give newly recognized sapient species a voice in determining their own fate, Sarah replied. Over the following hour, they developed a strategy that would fundamentally change the nature of the challenge. Instead of defending human contact methods, they would present a unified petition from dozens of newly contacted species demanding recognition of their rights as sapient beings. The bureaucratic revolution had become a diplomatic revolution. As Sarah prepared for her testimony before the Galactic Council, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. 6 months ago, she had been a young human scientist trying to prove herself worthy of galactic respect. Today, she was preparing to speak for hundreds of sapient species whose very existence challenged the assumptions that galactic civilization was built upon. The apex predators hadn't obeyed her commands because she was superior to them. They had chosen to work with her because she was the first being to recognize them as equals. Now, standing before the greatest political challenge of her career, Sarah understood that humanity's real contribution to galactic civilization wasn't superior technology or military might. It was the willingness to see intelligence in unexpected forms and to treat that intelligence with respect. Tomorrow, she would find out if the galaxy was ready for that lesson. The young human who had been mocked as a naive newcomer was about to reshape the fundamental principles of galactic civilization. And she was not going into that council chamber alone.